So we are ready to start. Thank you so much for coming to this Center for Digital Play talk. It is a great pleasure and an honor to have today as our distinguished speaker, Dr. Emil Lundedal Hammar, who's currently a postdoc at the design school here in Copenhagen, but who has worked at many different institutions over the years, Tampere, Finland, and Tromsø, where he took his PhD, and as well as Lund, and that's about it for the time being. Emil works on a very wide array of topics. When I invited him, I gave him a free choice, which topic did he want to talk about, and he returned 4 different topics, all of which he could speak very in depth about. It's now my turn to you cannot be honest right now. You have to enjoy. But he chose to talk about the power and politics of platform. The invitation was sent roughly when Unity took the very wise decision of, well, you all know the very wise decision Unity took. And Emil thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about that, and I agree. It's a great topic that we know very little about, and that it also shows what Emil excels at, which is the intersection between political science, economics, and game studies. So this is going to be a trip on that sort of multidisciplinary perspective on games. And I try every time I'm introducing one of our there's another reason why Emil is famous. His work was one of the foundations for the Danish government to decide on the creation of the Danish Games Institute. So thank you for doing that work. When I have to introduce a guest, I always try to think about why is it that I invite these people. And in the case of Emil, it's very easy. Some of us have been doing game studies for a long time, and one of the most interesting things is always to see young scholars who suddenly do things that we never thought possible, and who, I guess, with their work show the future of a field or a discipline. And I think Emil is showing us one of the futures of game studies. So I hope you enjoy as much as I will this talk. So thank you for accepting the invitation.
You. Thanks, Miguel. And thank you for calling me young as well. I don't really feel young. But so today, actually, Miguel mentioned the thing with the Unity debacle. It's kind of the motivation for the talk to like when I made the presentation, I thought it would be interesting just to kind of cover maybe the basics, also general kind of introduction about how we can study platforms, especially with relation to games. So it's not necessarily going to be maybe super in-depth research that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, but it's more maybe some of the interesting observations that I think could be productive to think about when we do game studies or when we talk about like cases such as the Unity debacle. I'll get into this, of course. Miguel already talked about who I am and what I do, right? So, PhD in games, culture, memory, race, colonialism. This is just to show you kind of like, if you ever want to have me for another guest lecture, you can also choose one of these other options. I've done some recent research that was published in Game Environments on labor organizing in the so-called Global North, and also the relation between fascism and imperialism in games. And then I'd like to pat myself on the back and say pioneering research and policy recommendations for the Danish games industry, as was used for the Danish Games Institute. At least that's what I like to say. And then, like what I think would be interesting to do, or like I said, is talk about platforms, political economy, international relations, and also maybe perhaps couch it in the Nordic welfare model, which I'll also show how this is the case, right? So we already touched upon the Unity debacle as the qualification or motivation for the talk, right? But we see a lot of different, instances or cases of like something weird going on with all these platforms that we use every day, right? So, for example, we see Netflix raise their prices, and you suddenly have to pay extra to share your passwords with people who use other devices or other IP addresses. We've had Facebook and Google having these major legal battles with entire nations, such as Australia and Canada. I'll go into this a bit more later, but there's also been a recent debacle about Danish public service using Amazon Web Services and Microsoft servers or licenses. Of course, Unity's runtime fee. And then I guess some more in the game industry context, we've heard this whole battle the last, 3 years or what, between Epic, Steam, and also Apple. So there's just some cases that like showcase there's something going on, right? I put this particular book by Ramon Lobato about Netflix nations that kind of like already goes forward or towards this particular discussion, which I think is really interesting about how Netflix all of a sudden is all over the world, right? It's Netflix everywhere, basically, is one of the key points that Lobato talks about. Because that's kind of already an appetizer of what I'll be talking about, right? Because on one hand, we can distinguish between markets and distribution when it comes to these platforms, but also geopolitics and legislation, especially about governments versus these platforms that we use. So those are kind of the 2 points that I kind of want to cover for today, right? So just to make it a bit general, I'll give a broad overview. I want to like cover first very very general, very kind of straightforward about like what are platforms. I know maybe a lot of people already know this, but I think what is particularly important or interesting is talking about the platformization of cultural production. That's like a fancy word to say how do platforms influence or affect the products or the media that we use on these platforms, right? And then one thing that I find a bit interesting, or I think that things we could take into account when we talk about platforms is, I talked about geopolitics as such, right? And this is the concept of platform imperialism that's developed or introduced by Dal-Jung Jin to talk about like what's actually going on geopolitically. And then of course couch it in some really interesting and good research about platform imperialism and the games industry done by David Nieborg and Daniel Joseph and Chris Young, that I'll try to cover to show like some of the interesting things going on right now in game studies and political economy. And then I'll use this to say, so what does this mean for the Nordics or the Danish games industry, or maybe other Nordic game industries, right? Okay, so just now we begin as such, but basically, just to briefly say, like when we talk about platforms, there's many different types. Nick Sierschnicek, who wrote Platform Capitalism in 2016, has like different types. He talks about advertising platforms, that's like Facebook and Google. There's cloud and hosting platforms such as Amazon Web Services. But there's also other things such as Siemens, who uses their platforms for industrial production. And he also talked about lean platforms. That's like platforms that don't really have any assets, but facilitate it. So you can think about Uber or Airbnb perhaps. They don't own the cars or the drivers. They don't own the houses that are being let. But they facilitate that transaction between drivers and customers, right? For example, Nick Sierschnicek doesn't talk about these for some reason, but you can kind of like say, I don't know, the YouTube, TikTok, app stores, perhaps even as content-driven platforms. And then you can perhaps also think about software tools as platforms, Microsoft Office with Word and everything, but also, of course, Unity, Unreal Engine, those type of things. And maybe even also hardware platforms that us who work with games know a lot about already or have worked with for decades, right? How that kind of structured games. One of the good things, so when we talk about platforms, I know I'm probably going to sound a little bit negative sometimes about or critical, not necessarily negative, but critical about some platforms, but there are some good things that they provide for, let's say, game developers, but also other kind of producers. What we've seen is, for example, that they lower the barrier of entry for people to distribute their products. It makes it much easier to put stuff out, especially on the App Store, but also Steam and other places. And they also provide a range of services that other, let's say, game developers, for example, would not be able to afford, such as network infrastructure, transactional services, having one store that every customer goes to, maybe even community management tools that you use for your regular games, and then also, of course, all the data that you also can get about how your product is performing. Like that, those are like good services that when I've talked to game developers or people who work at game companies, they say like, this has become much better and much easier with these platforms, right? This just to show you like they also do good stuff, if I sound too critical, right? Good. I have these two slides. I'm not necessarily, because platforms are kind of old in the sense like they've been there for a long time, or some might argue that platforms have been here for forever almost. But back in 2013, José Van Dijk, Thomas Pohl, and Martin Deval had this book about the platform society, just to show or qualify why platforms are so important, right? So we look at our phones, we have tons of, this is kind of self-explanatory, but I still feel like you kind of have to qualify why this is important, right? Our lives are dominated by technology platforms. I feel as if, at least maybe that's my age showing too, you had a lot of optimism about tech, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, where it's about like, it's free and transnational. We just have these apps, or not apps, we didn't call it that back then. We just have these the internet that was free, and you could do whatever you wanted. There was no like restrictions, and there was no kind of there was no boundaries or national borders. You were just there, right? You didn't really think about it in that way, right? So what they write is that it's kind of a connected world where a platform, or our society has become a connected world where platforms have penetrated the heart of societies, affecting institutions, economic transactions, and social and cultural practices, hence forcing governments and states to adjust their legal and democratic institutions, right? And that's perhaps best exemplified with what the EU is trying to do with the GDPR, as just one example, right? Just to show that, like, why this is important. But it's also important that we think about that they don't just reflect the social, that's what their argument is, but they also structure or produce the social structures that we live in, right? That they have some type of causality in terms of our behavior or our activities online or wherever we want to be, right? And then you can perhaps think about, like the platforms we use every day, like YouTube, Patreon, perhaps if people use that, Uber, Volt for food delivery. Like, what is it that they have made easier? What are the kind of activities or the things that we do? And what have they actually supplanted? What have they changed? So instead of calling to order a pizza, I can just go on an app instead. What is it that's going on? Or if I want to have information about what's going on in my local neighborhood, I have to log on Facebook and look at the group or the whatever about what's actually going on in the area. Just to see about, like, or think about already how do these platforms supplant other activities, and what do they also put pressure on? Yeah, I mean, this is kind of self-explanatory, but basically just that if you see, this is from Jathan Sadowski's article about rentier capitalism and platforms, but he basically just shows real quick like how much the tech sector have changed from 2009 to 2018 in terms of revenue and also investments. And here you can see the green area in terms of technology and consumer services, how huge it has become, and that's one of the things is due to platforms that will also show that I'll also show later. Good. Okay, so in terms of analyzing platforms, there's many different ways to do it, and so I just want to say, like, one way to do it, I think it's a really good book too, is Nick Seaver. He approaches it very from like an anthropological approach, where he just for example, if you want to study an algorithm, you want to see how Spotify chooses or selects or curates their platform in terms of your music tastes, that you go in and you look at them as social technical systems, that you go in and you see how programmers at Spotify think about their style of curation for their music style, for example, right? But one approach that you can also take, and one thing that I want to emphasize today is just the good old political economy of communication. I think this is also a really good book by Vincent Mosco, and it's about the study of the social relations, particularly the power relations that mutually constitute the production, distribution, and consumption of resources including communication resources. And I think this approach is very valuable or useful or productive when we talk about platforms in terms of especially their economic dominance and the things I talked in the beginning about with the markets and distribution, and also geopolitics and legislation. So that's the way, that's the thing that I kind of want to approach it as, right? Emil Lundedal Hammar, who just recently published this book actually about games in the platform economy. It just came out, so I haven't read it in full. I'm sorry, Annemette, if you're ever going to watch this recording. But she talks about platform configurations, for example, right? That their platforms have existed for a long time, and instead perhaps we should talk about different ways that platforms have been configured. You could perhaps think about a classic example that everybody probably, or many people in the audience know about game consoles. You know, that's kind of functions as an intermediary actor between a publishing company that publishes games, and then maybe a developer as such, with the consumers through the platforms, right? That's kind of like a classic example. But you can kind of think of it a bit different these days, right? So for example, Apple, they've kind of integrated everything in between, both using hardware and software. Yeah, let me just see, hang on. You can also think about Google. They do it differently than Apple. They don't do it like you only have your iOS store on one type of hardware device. They're more open. But then they also generate revenue from a lot of data collection. Facebook, I don't know how old people are here in the audience, but they used to be very desktop focused back in the day until mobile came in, and now they of course harvest or collect data from a different range of parameters from phones. Uber is also a kind of a different type of platform because it doesn't really, you know, allow any other drivers or anyone else to publish or do something on their platforms. It's not like Apple, for example, right? So we have many different types of platforms in this particular case, right? So if you want to kind of summarize the platform studies in terms of the key points that especially political economy talk about, is that we can consider them to be multi-sided markets. You know, you have like a matchmaker or an intermediary actor, that's the platform. And then that connects consumers, businesses, governments, nonprofits together. But what's particularly different nowadays is, and if we use, for example, Thomas Pohl, David Nieborg, and Brooke Duffy's definition, is it's data infrastructures that facilitate, aggregate, monetize, and govern interactions between end users and content and service providers. And then I've added the GS definitions too, where they also have the firm and national boundaries in it as well. That it's not just, you know, these different companies and this different platform, but it's also geographical distributed, right? So in a sense, they're also gatekeepers. You know, if you want to get on the iOS store, you have to agree to Apple's terms and services, and you're also at the mercy of algorithms. So Gillespie talk about that these algorithms are increasingly shaped by user interaction and feedback, but of which platforms remain in full control over, right? So you probably also see this already when, for example, YouTube suddenly changes their algorithms about and filtering certain things. I'll get into this later, of course, but you know, where suddenly this platform holder changes things out of the blue. You also have the example with Apple that changes the data collection or the privacy features on their iPhones or their devices, so that this unique identifier that all the hardware devices had could no longer be collected by advertising agencies or the data collection that's being tracked. And then a lot of companies, especially hyper casual game developers, they were affected by this because suddenly you couldn't harvest the same amount of information to sell to other third-party actors, for example, right? Just to illustrate like how much power the platform holders actually have, right? And of course, you have this data surveillance type of thing that's connected to a lot of tech platforms. You know, what we do, activities of users, that generates a lot of data that's extracted, codified, analyzed, and marketized. It's kind of self-explanatory. But also, you can look at them, at the platforms as walled gardens. You know, like you kind of have to agree to everything to enter this particular market or this particular garden in order to even distribute there. There's no kind of negotiation, such as, for example, when Epic complains about Apple's policies in terms of revenue sharing, or the cut that Apple takes from that, right? That you have to reach these things. And someone, Jathan Sadowski, also calls it a fiefdom in terms of it's a bit more complicated to talk about. But basically, what is also useful for this particular talk is GS quote where they say that these walled gardens or fiefdoms, they are fueled by speculative venture capital aiming to reap the rewards of future market dominance and exclusive access to streams of data. I'll get into this, why this is important, especially with the Unity debacle. That's like a very good example of what they're referring to here. Because if you, so if anyone want to read Nick Siesenczek's Platform Capitalism, is actually kind of very short, it's not very long, but it's good in terms of seeing, like, so how do platforms actually achieve dominance? How come Netflix became so big, or how come Apple's App Store or Steam and so on, how did they become so big? And then what Nick Siesenczek says is there's this thing called network effects within business studies, where it's basically the more users and the more producers you have within your kind of environment or your ecology, it has like a, what do you call it, more and more, you get more and more data that you then can use to improve your services more and more and more, and then therefore you create more value and better services through this type of thing, right? It's actually a way to what do you call it, exponential type of improvement of the platform itself, right? So once you kind of achieve more and more and more, like Facebook and Google and other things, then you kind of achieve almost a market dominance, right? This is what Nick Siesenczek it says, that platforms, that the way they operate, have monopolistic tendencies. So once you achieve like a pretty big, significant type of cut of or amount of users, then it's very difficult for challenges to come in, like to compete or to so what's called incumbents, like people, the platforms that came first, right? Once they achieve that type of dominance, it's hard to oppose them or dismantle them, right? So in the games industry, we probably have the Steam distribution service. That's probably a good example of this, right? So despite all these multi-billion companies like EA, Ubisoft, Activision Blizzard, Epic as well, they've tried to have their own PC digital distribution stores in, 10 years or something. They've tried to like avoid having to take the 30% cut that Steam takes from their revenue. But despite that, Steam is still dominant, right? Despite all the billions of dollars that they've also spent on these services. And once you kind of achieve this type of dominance, then you kind of have this rentier form of capitalism where you can, you don't really have to sell a product as such. Apple doesn't necessarily have to constantly produce things on their app stores to sell. They can just extract revenue, kind of like when you pay your rent for your house every month, right? That you just automatically get revenue or income despite having any type of sale or transaction that you're selling, right? So this is, of course, very, very sexy and attractive for if you're like an investor or anything, because you get stable and reliable revenue instead of having this one-time purchase, right? You can also think about subscription and fees and other things as these types of income, right? And so what happens is you get this kind of winner-takes-all type of market that the early adopters of successful platforms can gain big followings if they're also lucky. For example, if we use Zynga, for those who remember Zynga, they started out building their game businesses by using Facebook very early, when it was mostly desktop oriented, and have kind of stayed in that dominant position for a long time. So basically what you see when you analyze the games market, you see that there's a very small percentage of cultural producers that actually generate the vast majority of revenue. But then the thing is that the more end users you get on the platforms, then the platform's power grows. So it's not like Zynga necessarily got more power as such. They did manage to generate a lot of revenue in their the different games that they have, their Facebook games. But once Facebook changed the API, then that also meant that Zynga had to adapt or change their business model as well, right? So that does not necessarily mean that Zynga, even though they were very popular in the beginning and had made a lot of money and were an incumbent, they were still at the behest of the platform, right? And I mentioned the Apple thing where they changed the privacy settings. I quickly talked about YouTube's filtering or algorithm filtering, that like a couple of years ago they changed it so that sensitive content meant that some videos got demonetized or filtered out of the search results. Where, for example, all of a sudden, if there was something that was LGBTQ coded or whatever in the algorithm, that was defined as a sexual content, right? And you can of course see this, the Unity runtime debacle. That was a good case of similar type of thing, where all of a sudden people have been investing their resources and their time, like game companies and also educational institutions, on how to use Unity, and then all of a sudden you have this out of the blue type of change that causes a lot of controversy, right? So the platform still has a lot of power despite many things. I mentioned the Danish public authorities, and this is an interesting case where this one actually came out a couple of weeks ago in Ingeniøren, or the Engineer, the newspaper, where the headline for the article is big rises in big price costs or whatever, and illegal terms. Danish authorities have locked themselves to big tech from the US. And that's basically about how municipalities rely on Microsoft and also Amazon Web Services for licenses. And basically in this article they say there's no open market. There's only these companies we can go to get the services we need. So for example, for those who have kids, you may know Aula. And Aula is for child institutions or whatever you call it, and parents to communicate with them, between them. But they use, for example, Amazon Web Services, and there's a whole bunch of data surveillance for that, for example, right? And in terms of Microsoft, in the last couple of years, they've increased their prices by 40%, which also meant that the municipalities had to cut in other areas because they're not getting more money from the government as such. And what they actually say is that these platforms that they use, or these technologies that they rely on, they can be considered public service infrastructure, like critical infrastructure, and not just like a separate digital sector, right? And what they say, this is kind of a quote translated from Danish, that nothing is up for negotiation. They can't really do anything. And if they wanted to divest from this, as you all, or perhaps many already know with the Unity debacle too, you can't just say, okay, we're just going to switch engines, right? Or we're just going to switch and do this. You have a pipeline, you have all the kinds of things that you have to change, right? So it's not so easy just to say, well, we'll just go somewhere else. Good. So in terms of how a platform develops or grow, there's a really good book that came out recently called Choke Point Capitalism, where they talk about, for example, how Amazon managed to become so big. For example, started out as only selling books, and then all of a sudden it's this big monster, squid monster that takes over everything, right? But also Spotify, they also look into that, right? But you can kind of categorize it or distinguish between two phases. You have the launch phase first, where you have significant capital investment, like you have a lot of money being spent on launching the service or the platform. And the important thing is that you grow, you get more and more users on board. It's not so important if you have a lot of losses, like financial losses. That's okay that you don't make any money. And so what you do to get users or businesses or other actors on board is that you offer a lot of incentives or perks. You can think about Epic when they try to challenge Steam, for example. They offer a lot of free games. They also say to game companies, you can get an 8% cut instead of a 12% cut, instead of a 30% cut in Steam, and maybe you do like free access to tools and so on, right? You want to really get everyone on board, and you spend a lot of money on trying to get through that. But then once you reach kind of a maturity phase, or when venture capital, or the people who invested into these platforms, they want their money back or have some type of return of investment, then you kind of change the business model, right? You change the pricing structure. That's what we talked about in the beginning of the examples I had, right? Netflix also raises their prices. Unity suddenly says, yeah, you know everything Unity did probably. And then also what is important is the individual cultural producers become less important because, again, also with Unity, indie developers in the scheme of like small time indie game developers didn't really mean a lot in the overall picture because the revenue that they accounted for was very, very small. What Unity cared about was a lot of the big fish, like we talked about earlier, that a small number of companies take up the vast majority of the revenue that's generated in the games industry. So even though people were complaining, things did change, but even though like a lot of indie developers were complaining, like from my view, in terms of political economy, they don't really matter in the scheme of things because you're just small fish, and that's not you're not the one we care about. We care about these big producers, right? And then of course you have all these intermediaries as well that gain a significant type of role. Like a lot of, for example, with Google and Facebook's ad data collection, you have a lot of like, I don't know what you want to call it, like parasites or whatever. Like you have these different advertising brokers that use Google or Facebook's kind of data to sell off or auction off, for example. But yeah, so that's kind of like if you want to divide these into two different things, right? Yeah, I don't want to. So I talked about these different things. This is a very basic, general introduction to like. So what are platforms? What do they do? Why do they do what they do? But I think what does this actually mean then for the culture we use or we play with or we consume or whatever you want to call it? And here, I think a really good book that came out 2 years ago by Thomas Pohl and David Nieborg and Brooke Duffy. They talk about platforms and cultural production. And this is inspired also by an article they wrote in 2018 called the platformization of culture production, right? And so while we talked about that platforms do allow for lower barrier of entry, it's easier to make games, to distribute and make games. You find new audiences. All of a sudden, Danish game companies can reach globally a lot of different types of consumer markets. They don't have to go through Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo. And we also get more revenue. So if you also look at different game industries, you can also see as mobile came in and the lower barrier of entry came in, you can see there's just like a lot more money being made. And mobile now is a bigger market than PC and console combined now as well, right? So there's clearly like new opportunities for game companies. There's no doubt about that, right? But what they talk about is that, but while things have been very successful, there's a lot of like unprecedented concentration of economic, infrastructural, and political cultural power among the platforms, right? That Apple gets to choose a lot of things, as to even when Epic, who also have billions of dollars behind them in trying to sue them or oppose them, can't really defeat them still, right? Or not defeat them, but open up or make better terms for cultural producers. So the thing is, it's not just dominance that's important that we're talking about. It's not just people say, "Oh, Apple, I'm subjected to your awful terms," right? But it's also that you have kind of mutual unequal relations of dependency, because when you talk to game companies, they're not going to say like, "No, I don't like the App Store. I don't like this." They do like it, with the ones I've talked to at least, like because it opens up new opportunities, like I mentioned, right? But this also means that a lot of companies or cultural producers, they become dependent on these platforms, right? They are dependent. So what they talk about, the authors here, is that when you are on a platform, especially as a cultural producer, then it also has an effect on the production, distribution, and circulation of cultural content, right? So this is what they call platformization, right? That platforms have an effect on what the cultural products we see, right? So So what their argument is that you end up with what is called a contingent cultural commodity, and that is meant in terms of things always change or can be updated all the time, right? So you can think about how all of a sudden, I guess with you can, like, if we use games as an example, we used to have these what is called premium games. You had a one-time purchase, then you get this particular game, you might get an update and so on. But instead we've moved into games as a service, like that you constantly update, you constantly have a product or an IP that you has a long tail in terms of sales, but also you keep updating it or keep providing content for it. And then you have multiple different types of business models for this. You know, you have the paid premium type, but you also have the free, you have the freemium, you have subscription, you have hyper casual, you have all these battle passes or season passes that we've also seen in other games, right? So all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but if through time on these platforms, games have also changed a lot in terms of how they are, what they are, right? Actually, I talked to Rune. He mentioned my brother. He mentioned that he went into a school and talked about how do these young kids, how do they define or understand games, and a lot of them explained them as or said that they're defined as these. You go in and there's like a store to buy stuff, and there's it's like almost like a platform in itself. That it's not just like a single purchase that you get, but it's you go in and then there's a store with loot boxes and with microtransactions, and this is what a game is, right? Also already kind of illustrating like how games have kind of changed or been affected by this. If you want to move away from games, you can also think about news media, because they need people to click on their articles in order to gain this data. They do these clickbait articles that has also changed a lot about in terms of news media. That's like one way, for example, that we talk about how platformization of cultural content, right? Good. Okay. Yeah. So that's just to show kind of like, like how do these platforms affect the games or the products that we're engaging with. One thing then that I kind of want to move into now is then maybe highlighting things that are rarely talked about, or at least maybe I'm getting old and I feel like this is my biases in terms of how I grew up or how I was taught by Miguel and who others. I don't know. But things that we don't really talk so much about is some of these things that I want to go into here, right? So in terms of technologies and platforms and all these things, kind of what I've grown up with, I feel as if these just kind of exist. You know, this is perhaps best exemplified with the cloud analogy. You know, you say like, we probably already know what I'm getting into, right? But that basically it's just like Dropbox and all these other services in Google Drive. It's just like a cloud that you upload your stuff into, and then it's just up in the air somewhere, and you download them down again, right? Of course, this is a naive. Everybody knows now. I guess that's why I'm saying like it might be my age showing, but I feel this is still kind of a case that we don't talk so much about, right? The environmental aspects, or the material aspects, right? And so, for example, here is a internet undersea cable, and this is basically to say like, okay, this is actually the internet. It's not just like this cloud thing. There's a recent book by Kate Crawford called Atlas of AI. They also talk about the hidden labor that's underpinning a lot of the services and platforms that we're using, right? So when we talk about, I don't know if it's ChatGPT or any of the other AI services, but also you can think about Facebook's moderation policies. There's like people who sit in very sweatshop-like conditions, maybe in Africa or South Asia, to do a lot of the stuff we don't really see behind the screen, right? And that's why, so when we talk about platforms, they're not just there. They're not just like Netflix, just there on my TV or on my phone. It's located somewhere, right? That's kind of the thing that I want to emphasize, because there are these certain things, these certain like material things, and that also means that there are geopolitical and jurisdictional effects on what platforms are. So like, for example, if we look at different undersea cables that connect the internet for us, you see it has a lot to do with nation states. So this is the next thing I kind of want to emphasize when we talk about platforms, that they're not just these neutral, innocent actors, but they are couched in national or geographical kind of distribution. Right? So there's a recent article by Wolf and Schindler called The US-China Rivalry and the Emergence of State Platform Capitalism. They talk about how platforms and the state kind of merge together. So they write here, for example, in the article, Kenny and others describe platforms as, in effect, private regulatory systems that exercise power independently of states, but this focus on domestic state business conflicts over regulatory capacity obscures a significant and growing alignment of interest between national states and digital platforms. In particular, the colossal economic significance, geographical concentration, and governance affordances of digital platforms render them both attractive and amenable to both the oversight of and instrumentalization by the US and Chinese states, right? So that we see this, perhaps, I'm not sure if I have it on this slide, but you have these different struggles. We talked about the EU with the GDPR, trying to like legislate against Facebook and Google and other US-based companies. But also we have in recent years, the debates about Huawei and 5G technology. And of course TikTok as well, that was, I think last year, came up in the US Senate, where it was viewed as this very invasive and surveillance type of technology. So there are these kind of struggles between where both technology platforms or companies, they kind of go together with their governments to fight certain battles and such, right? So the thing is, it was there. So the thing is, if what I find, this is a suggestion, it's not to say this is how you need to do it, but one way that I like to analyze, or that I've found very productive to analyze, talk about this, is the theory on imperialism. And for those who are well versed in platform studies and also some of the critical technology studies, there's been this talk about data colonialism. You know, for example, that data is the new oil is one of the expressions that has come up a lot. But I feel, at least in my view, that a lot of this discussion about data colonialism is already being talked about within, if you use or apply the theory on imperialism, right? Because what's imperialism in terms of a theory here is, or a Marxist theory, is that it's not just like a territorial conquest, but it's economic, cultural, and political power, right? I'm not sure how much I should go into the details, but basically Lenin was probably one of the first who talked about this, and it's not just to attribute it to him as a good theorist about this, but it's a good kind of formulation to think about it, right? And he calls imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, where the state aligns with big monopoly firms to expand economic and political power in order to, for example, seek new markets, because you run out of purchasing power, perhaps, from your domestic markets. This has been, imperialist theory has kind of been developed and talked about, and especially in the monthly review tradition, I would call them. But basically you have these concepts called value transfer and dependency theory, where you distinguish between, and I think maybe it's almost intuitive for a lot of people, between the so-called global north and the global south, right? So basically you have, I'll show this in a second, how this is illustrated. But you have these two divisions, where countries in the global north rely on the super exploitation of those in the peripheries. You have a value transfer between the two. There's some interesting studies, if you ever want to read it, I put it on the slides. Tricontinental Institute have, like, for example, about the Apple iPhone, in terms of how much value transfers goes on between the labor being applied to the iPhone. But also John Smith, who wrote this really good book called Imperialism in the 21st Century, talked about how can you analyze that in a coffee cup. Like, what is the value transfer for this, for example. I'm not going to go to, this is just kind of like, you see this thing is, once you see this, it's kind of like those glasses. Once you start using those glasses, you start seeing this everywhere. It lives? They live, yeah. But once you start seeing this, you kind of see this kind of division between the world. For example, here is, in terms of world wealth map, you see North America, Europe, Australia, Japan perhaps, and South Korea. You have per capita greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions, susceptibility to climate change as well. I guess China and Russia is included here. Denmark is not doing so well either, but anyway, you start seeing this division, right? So with the coronavirus, I thought that was also illustrative too, right? That in terms of who got access to the vaccines first, you had this kind of similar type of distinction as well. And then when it came up in, I can't remember if it was the UN or where it was, where they voted on, what do you call it, not using the patent, like, what do you call it, the English word for it. But you let go of the patent or the legal rights to this particular vaccine so everybody can produce it and use it. And here the vote was, of course, you see the so-called global north voted against this, for example, right? And of course also those who play golf. So there's no shade against golf. I don't play it myself, but yeah. But anyway, the reason why I introduce about the reason why I talk about imperialism is because Daniel Yen wrote this book in published this book in 2015, where he basically talks about these issues in relation to platforms. So, I mean, the study he's done is probably almost 10 years old now. It would be interesting to see how it looks now, but basically, you know, the internet or what we use is dominated by a lot of American-based or US-based companies, right? We even have a term for it in some of the critical technology studies called GAFAM: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. You know, even the stuff we use here now. And what he basically looked at back in 2014 was like the most visited sites were US based. There was 72%. 98 of the 100 most visitors are profit oriented. So not like Wikipedia, for example, would be an example of something that's not profit oriented. Mobile market is effectively a duopoly. Apple and Google kind of reign supreme. In terms of operating system, I know I'm on a Mac here now, but that's like 90% for back when he did it. So you basically have these, examples of America or the US dominating a lot of things, right? So the thing is, then what Daniel Yen say, how is this power utilized in terms of these different companies? You have legislation, patents, and copyright to uphold like that you cannot just simply take Microsoft software and do whatever you want with it, or you can't just invent things that are similar because they have a patent or a copyright on certain things. You have revenue capture of producers. So when you produce or distribute a game on the App Store, 30% gets to Apple, that's located in the US. And of course you have this is a big topic that's especially came up since Edward Snowden talked about revealed some of his stuff, but basically the mass surveillance data harvesting for both private companies and the security state. But also perhaps culture as well as dictated, right? So what Jen writes is platform developers clearly impose their symbolic hegemony onto most developing countries that buy and use platforms and therefore provide their labor to benefit platform investors in countries owning these platforms. So I think it was a couple of years ago, someone posted this photograph from the Vietnam War, this famous photograph of like a Vietnamese child running away from, I can't remember the exact things, but from the Vietnam War. It was gruesome, horrible, so on. But Facebook banned the photo, and then it turned into a huge national controversy up in Norway, because all of a sudden this was a form of, I don't know what you call it, censorship, but at least removal of important historical moments, right? So then Norway was, a lot of Norwegians were at least very upset, or like saying, then I'm gonna in protest start posting this picture from the Vietnam War. I'll have a game example of this as well later. So the thing is with these platforms, there's little to no oversight. We can't really, at least here in Denmark and other places, have an input into what they do or what they decide, because they're based over in Silicon Valley. We don't really get to say how they structure or do their platforms. You have these different cases, the legal battles. We also GDPR. There's also a recent EU legislation I haven't looked into called, I think it was CHIPS or something, can't remember. But there's been these attempts at trying to curtail or control them, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I don't want to talk too much about this. Because I think we're also heading a bit over time. But there's been a lot of battles with China, especially, right? There's different examples where the private companies go together with the U.S. state to ban Chinese tech. So what we talked about in the beginning, platforms favor incumbents. The incumbents are usually U.S. companies. Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you. So there's been some really good stuff in game studies about video games and platform imperialism. So this particular article is called App Imperialism, the Political Economy of the Canadian App Store, where they look into the Canadian game scene, the game industry, and like what games do they develop, how are they performing on the iOS App Store. They looked at between 2015 to 2017 and see like so who are the companies generating the most money, like where are they from? And also where do the Canadian companies that generate money, where did their money go, for example, right? So I'm not going to go into every point in the article, but basically they show that across these different years that they looked into it, the incumbents stay strong, like the companies that started out strong, remain strong or dominant. The incumbents just happen to be US companies. If you want to, do a more revenue capture, if a nation state or a company wants to have a bigger slice of the pie, it's more difficult to get into the market or become like a dominant position, but instead you have to acquire the companies of the studio. So what they show in their research is Tencent coming in and buying like a Finnish game companies meant that all of a sudden in the years that they analyzed, Tencent or China also became like a bigger actor in terms of revenue capture. So they basically say there's intensification of corporate concentration, the commodification of cultural content, and the unidirectional flow of global capital, right? So what they show in their article, David Nieborg, Chris Young, and Daniel Joseph, is precisely this economic analysis that illustrates the theory on imperialism in terms of games and platforms. It's a really good article, I think. So here they have like some tables that kind of illustrate what they talked about, where they divided. The first table is revenue generation by nation states, and then revenue capture by nation states here, and you can see how the United States and Finland are at the top. But when they talk about revenue capture in terms of companies that own these game companies that are generating revenue, you see China, for example, coming in, right? And you see as well that like the US is like 49% over there in the revenue generation and 44 here, and like almost stable, right? A recent article that this same authors just published, this is I actually don't know which journal it got accepted in, but this is a preprint that I got sent, and where they have they talk about source diversity and value capture with the same type of approach, right? So they say, while a great many gatekeepers from telecom providers to news organizations have lost their dominant position in local media economies, after platforms came, tech platforms came, we see new incumbencies emerge that increasingly start to reflect decade-old institutional power imbalances. That is, we argue that many of the new imbalances in the platform economy map onto existing global cultural flows from the north to the global south, and vice versa, capital flows from the global south to the north. So kind of what they talk about is two different things here, that on one hand, the global north, or especially the US cultural products, are being disseminated to the global south. And then there's also an economic imperialism in terms of what we talked about earlier with the parasitic relationship, where the south sends money or flows money towards the north, right? So basically they kind of go into showing also that while there might be a lower barrier of entry, that we see more game companies, especially in the global south, producing games. You have apps distribution and Unity. It makes it possible to enter markets. But they found out that even though we might have more diversity in terms of the different games that are on these platforms, it still remains that the value capture and incumbency in terms of who's generating the most money and who came first is still the dominant US game companies. So they see here that our data shows that the hyper-competitive and highly stratified nature of the top 100 most earning games will lead to less well-capitalized studios and less advertised apps to quickly disappear from this. If this structure persists, South-South and South-North cultural and capital flows are likely to remain marginal. So even though things might change around in terms of the top 100 most generating companies, it'll still, their study or their data shows that things are not that different, right? So I don't think I want to, because I think it's a bit, so moving from this to the Nordic context, the interview is not that important to go through, we don't have that much time anyway, but basically the Minister of Culture was out saying that when they want to make this new Danish Games Institute that they proposed for the finance law, one of the arguments he says in this TV2 interview is, I want Danish games and not ones made in Beijing or in Shanghai. That's like what he says, for example, like as motivation, right? And I think this is kind of what I've talked about in one of my Danish language articles. So I have this article in the Nordic Media Studies journal called National Economic and Cultural Challenges for Nordic Games Industries in a Platform Capitalistic World, where I basically apply what Nyborg, Young, and Joseph have kind of talked about to Danish and the Norwegian games industries, right? But not only because of their industries, but also because of their funding bodies, right? So we have in Norway, you have a funding scheme that kind of, it used to, not so much anymore, I think. They used to say in their legislation or their directives that we want to promote Norwegian national culture in the products or the projects that we want to fund or do, right? And the same with Denmark's DFI's spilordningen. It's also like we are making Danish cultural products, or we want to cultivate Danish national culture in a sense, right? That stands out on the global market, perhaps. And so, if this is the case with these funding schemes, what does that mean in terms of what we learned in terms of platform imperialism and platformization and these other things, right? So, for example, what does it mean then that US platforms restrict the content or the games that are being able to put out? In 2016, the Danish game Le Petit Mort, which has like sexually suggestive content in it, in terms of, I think it's a vagina or something, got banned from the Apple App Store because sex is not allowed, I think, in the Apple App Store, as one example. So even though the game got Danish public funding, it was not allowed to be distributed for Apple hardware, as just one example, right? So, at the same time, you have also this economic aspect, right? So what does it mean that we want to cultivate a Danish games industry, and we want to have commercially successful games, but still we have to give 30% of what revenue we have to these profit-oriented companies in Silicon Valley, for example, right? And what they have shown, Dan, Joseph, and the other guys, in terms of incumbency, is that even the Canadian games industry is unable to challenge the ones dominating. So now we're nearing the end, just in terms of saying like, annoying that Morozov's quote is there, but there has been some initiatives to try to curtail this, or try to have this kind of battle in terms of what's called there's been in discussions in Creative Europe, they've been having discussions about what does it mean that we are putting content or games out on these US tech platforms. But also the European Game Developer Foundation, they actually had one they want to make this manifesto that they want to use send out to the EU Commission to say like, these are the kind of the things that we want to prioritize for healthy European game development. And the third point in that manifesto, this was like 2 weeks ago, I think they posted in a Facebook group. You know, it was like, the union must protect the fundamental rights of the game developers in the platform and data economy, and then they have these different points in terms of regulating, you know, game distribution platforms must respect European fundamental rights, platform censorship must be transparent, right? And then this joke was supposed to come in afterwards. I'm sorry it didn't come in. But basically, these are really good examples or like initiatives. But what Evgeny Morozov kind of like joked about 5 years ago with the GDPR is that the new social democratic consensus is making sure that the algorithms that will dispossess and exploit you are thoroughly ethical and transparent, right? So basically just that, these are all nice, this is just kind of to be a bit more radical or critical, is that even though these are like nice initiatives, they don't really get to the heart of the problem. So you can probably perhaps think about what to do. So what should we do? You all in these talks, you all always have to be this type of, what's the positive, what's the good thing, and so on, right? And then you can ask yourself, do we need our own European app stores? Should we just legislate against the US companies according to EU rules? Should we maybe think about private and profit-oriented platforms? This should be something else. You can also look at historical examples. So the New World Information and Communication Order in the 70s and 80s was an interesting collaboration, I would say, or organization that wanted to say, so how can we ensure that companies in what was then called the third world, countries in the third world, were able to access and distribute information or communication, right? Evgeny Morozov has talked about this thing a lot too in terms of the national sovereignty over tech platforms. He has this talk called Come and Forget the Internet, where he talks about how much behind the EU is when it comes to this question. And he recently had a really interesting historical documentary or podcast, I don't know what you want to call it, called the Santiago Boys, that looks at the Salvador Allende, who wanted to implement their own Chilean, communication or tech platform in the 70s, and how that got ruined by the US and other extreme right-wing actors. And then you can also ask, maybe even theoretically, so what would happen if the EU suddenly said, now we're going to build our own great, what is they call China, the Great Firewall, right? We're going to do our own European Great Firewall, and so on, right? How would the US respond to this? So, this was a lot. I'm sorry also it took an hour almost, but basically I just wanted to talk about platforms and platform imperialism, about questions of national sovereignty, and then specifically in terms of games, how do they favor US incumbents, the platforms there, and that source diversity does not mean popularity or success necessarily, and how can we increase democratic control, or what solutions. So those are kind of the thoughts or the things that I wanted to introduce. And like I said in the beginning, this is kind of a future research study, so this is not necessarily something that I'm super 10 years experience with this, but something that I think would be interesting or important to consider or talk about, because especially the national question is really big these days, especially at the EU level. So these are some of the research points that I wanted to show. So thanks.